Hey, everyone, welcome back. So, you know those stories you hear, the ones where things just spiral out of control and you end up doing something you never thought you were capable of? This is one of those, the time my attempt to save a few bucks on heating turned into an accidental, but totally justified, act of property demolition against the worst neighbor I've ever had to deal with, the HOA Queen. I live up in the Cascades, in one of those planned rustic chic communities, where the brochure photos show guys in expensive flannel chopping wood. But the rule book is 40 pages long. I bought a little cedar cabin, nothing massive, just enough room for me and my dog, and I run my custom furniture business right out of the detached garage. It's quiet, it's mine, and I absolutely love the cold air, which is the main problem. Winters here are brutal, and heating a two-story place with electric forced air? That's basically asking the utility company for a second mortgage. So, my old stone fireplace, that thing isn't just aesthetic, it's the difference between a reasonable bill and, seriously, donating plasma to cover the power costs. Now, I'm one of those weird guys who actually enjoys splitting and stacking. It's therapy. I built this really neat gravel pad right behind the garage. Everything is stacked perfectly, shoulder height, oak and maple cut to the same length, and I even hit the ends with a little blue spray paint, so I could track exactly how long they've been seasoning. It was borderline obsessive, but it meant I always had dry, perfect fuel. And it was all on my property, nowhere near the shared fence line. I was a model Firewood citizen. The trouble, the epic, life-altering trouble, started when Brenda moved in. We'll call her Brenda Sterling, because everything about her screamed expensive, polished, and totally fake. Think perfect blonde bob, a diamond as big as my thumb, and an Escalade she only drove to the mailbox. She started going to HOA meetings, and within 18 months, she was the president of the Ridgeview Estates Board. And man, did things go sideways fast. Suddenly, my clean work truck, the one I actually earn a living with, was an eyesore. A lawnmower I left leaning against the back wall for 15 minutes was deemed clutter impacting visual cohesion. The fines started small, passive-aggressive notes stapled to newsletters, talking about the HOA's vision for low-clutter living and how bulk storage, meaning my wood, was discouraged. But the rules, the actual covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CCRs, said wood storage was fine, provided it was neatly stacked and on my property. I had photos with timestamps. I was Teflon. Brenda, however, was persistent. At a community mixer, she cornered me, talking about how everyone should really use the approved vendor, a local guy, because their wood was supposedly safer, cleaner, and better for the community image. By a truly wild coincidence, that vendor was her golf buddy's new company. When I politely, but firmly, told her I'd stick to splitting my own, she gave me that tight, porcelain smile, the one that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "Well, just remember, David, if neighbors start complaining about safety or aesthetics, the board has to consider the majority." It was a clear, icy threat. I just shrugged it off, until the first major cold snap hit. I track my consumption like a hawk. I know exactly how many rows I burn per week when the temperature drops below freezing. So, when I went out one morning and saw a very distinct, noticeable gap, not much, just maybe half a dozen logs missing from the middle of a perfectly stacked row, I knew something was wrong. I thought, maybe I miscounted. Maybe the stack settled. But then it happened again. And again. Over a week, the side of the stack closest to the old wooden fence, the side bordering Brenda's property, kept getting thinner. I live alone. I don't sleepwalk and accidentally burn premium maple. Someone was taking my wood. The pieces clicked late one evening. I was doing dishes, kitchen lights off, and I glanced out the window, which gives a clear line of sight to the back fence. I saw a movement, a weak phone flashlight beam flickering. Two figures were at the fence line. One of them, a smaller one, pushed hard on a section of the old fence I always thought looked loose. The panel flexed, creating a gap big enough to reach through. The other figure, definitely the handyman Brenda always had doing projects, reached in and started pulling my precious, seasoned, blue-painted logs out, passing them through the hole. They weren't even trying to be sneaky. They were absolutely brazen. I grabbed my phone, but by the time I dried my hands, they'd replaced the fence panel and vanished. I managed one blurry, grainy photo through the glass, two shadows standing where they shouldn't be. The smaller shadow? Definitely her teenage son. I was furious. My first instinct was to run out and scream, but the voice in my head, the lawyer voice, said, "She will spin this. You screaming at her minor son in the dark will become threats and unstable behavior." I decided to collect definitive proof instead. 2 nights later, Brenda hosted a winter hearth cocktail hour. Normally, I'd rather wrestle a grizzly bear than go to an HOA event, but now I was curious. I showed up, made small talk, and casually drifted toward her gigantic, expensive stone fireplace. And there they were, stacked neatly in her decorative metal rack were half a dozen logs. Not just birch, but wood with the exact same cut, the same kind of wear, and yes, the faint, faded smudge of blue paint on the end. I walked over, pretending to admire the mantelpiece, and picked one up. It had a massive, ugly knot, a distinctive scar I remembered cursing at when I split it because it almost ruined my wedge. It was mine. My jaw literally clenched so hard it hurt. I found Brenda refilling her wine in the kitchen, and I kept my voice dead level. "Hey, Brenda, weird question. Have you noticed any firewood going missing lately?" She raised an eyebrow, the picture of bored innocence. "No, why?" "Well," I continued, "I've had several rows disappear from my stack, and I happened to see your son and your handyman by my fence last night, and your rack over there is full of wood that looks exactly like mine." I didn't accuse. I just laid out the facts. She let out a little, practiced social laugh, the kind that says, "This is a joke, but I'm too gracious to point it out. Everyone in Ridgeview uses birch, David. You don't own a tree species." "True," I said, leaning closer, my voice dropping, "but I mark my ends. And those have my markings." Her smile snapped tight. "Are you seriously accusing my family of stealing wood? Maybe if your wood pile wasn't such a mess, you'd know what you have." And there it was, the pivot. She immediately changed the subject back to the fines. "You know, we've gotten several comments about that pile. It's very industrial. Not really in the spirit of our community resort image. If people are concerned about safety or aesthetics, the board has to address that." She was moving from theft to financial coercion. She wanted me out of my wood, so I had to buy from her friend. I walked away before I said something that would land me in jail. The official notice arrived a few days later. Violation, unsightly and non-compliant with storage. The rule citation was ripped so far out of context it was laughable. It warned of daily fines. They were literally stealing my product, then fining me for trying to store it. The gaslighting was total. I tried the civilized route. I went to the HOA meeting with a folder of photos, highlighted CCRs, and a calm, rational explanation. When I mentioned the theft, Brenda, chairing the meeting, cut me off, introducing my item as, "We have an owner who's confused about our standards and had a misunderstanding at a private social gathering." She lied, claiming I had been aggressive and accused her family of theft in front of guests. She claimed neighbors found my pile junkyard-like. The other board members, mostly retired folks who feared conflict more than asbestos, just rolled over. The treasurer shrugged and said, "The violation stands as written. Hire a lawyer if you want mediation." I filed a non-emergency police report. The officer was polite, looked at my blurry photo, and gave me the sad truth. It's firewood. Dollar-wise, it's nothing. You don't have a clear video, and your neighbor will just say she bought similar wood from a store. Legally, I was stuck. Fighting the HOA would cost more in legal fees than the fines, and Brenda knew it. I was losing money, losing wood, and facing perpetual harassment, all orchestrated by the thief herself. That's when the darkness settled in. In my garage, I have a big plastic tub, leftovers from various projects. In one corner, I had a stash of fireworks, the heavy, loud kind, bought out of state years ago for a bonfire that got rained out. They were definitely illegal in this county, high yield, and absolutely not meant for indoor use. I'd been meaning to get rid of them properly, but you know how it is. Life happens, they just sit there, taking up space. I was stress organizing after that meeting, staring into that tub, when the intrusive thought hit me. A truly terrible, dangerous, but exquisitely satisfying idea. What if Brenda dealt with these instead of me? I went back and forth for days. It was dangerous, I knew that. But I kept replaying the mental video. Her son and the handyman's hands reaching through my fence. Brenda's smirking face at the party. The board shrugging off my legal rights. I eventually convinced myself of this. If I made it crystal clear that something was dangerous and not for indoor use, Anyone who took it, ignored the warnings, and did the exact opposite, was accepting that risk. And the only person brazen enough to keep stealing from that exact same spot was Brenda. It was flawed logic, but it was the lifeline my rage grabbed onto. The plan was simple, if deeply unethical: make explosive bait. I grabbed a couple of the ugliest, twistiest logs from the back of my pile, the kind you'd only use for an outdoor fire ring. I hollowed them out a bit and carefully lodged a couple of the larger fireworks inside. I won't detail the process, but they looked like normal, ugly logs at a glance. Then came the warning label. I found an old wooden crate, reinforced the bottom, put the 2 modified logs inside, and added a couple of regular ones for cover. I screwed a lid on tight. On 3 sides of that crate, in thick, sloppy black marker, I wrote the most ridiculous, over-the-top warning you could imagine. Firework logs. Outdoor use only. High risk. Do not burn indoors. Explicitly not for fireplaces. It looked like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon, but that was the point. If someone saw that, they would immediately know this wasn't normal firewood. It was explicitly for my outdoor use. I set the crate near the edge of my gravel pad, close to the fence, right in the sticky fingers zone. Then I waited. The chat was full of people posting cozy photos of their fireplaces, Brenda included, of course, with her perfect family by the giant stone hearth. I moved my goodwood far away. The only thing near that loose fence panel was the brightly marked crate. A couple of evenings went by. Nothing. Then, I was sitting on the couch, headphones on, deep into a video game, when I got up for a drink. Habit made me glance through the kitchen curtain. And there they were again. Same 2 silhouettes, same flickering phone light, same fence panel being pushed in. I watched the handyman walk straight to the crate. He held his phone up, clearly reading the giant warnings plastered on the side. He opened the lid, looked inside, paused for a moment, and then started handing the logs over to the kid. They didn't even look at the rest of my neat stacks. They closed the lid, replaced the panel, and disappeared into the night. I stood there, heart hammering, thinking, you read the warnings. You ignored them. You made your choice. I didn't sleep much that night. The bang didn't come immediately. They must have stacked the logs somewhere for later. It came a few days after. It wasn't a crack or a pop. It was a deep, guttural thump, a shudder that shook my entire cabin. A split second later, I heard glass shattering and someone screaming. I ripped the headphones off and ran outside. The first thing I saw was a plume of smoke and dust billowing out of Brenda's fancy living room windows. The entire front bay window had a massive spiderweb crack with a huge hole right in the center. Neighbors were streaming out of their houses. I walked closer, making sure I looked appropriately concerned. Brenda's front door swung open, and people stumbled out, coughing and rubbing their eyes. Her husband had a cut on his forehead. One guest had blood on their arm from glass. And then came Brenda, covered in soot and dust, screaming hysterically about her house exploding. The fire department arrived quickly, checking for active fire. From the sidewalk, I could see inside the living room. It was chaos. The heavy stone mantelpiece was partially collapsed. The giant flat-screen TV mounted above it was on the floor at a weird angle, the screen shattered. The fireplace itself was bent and twisted. One of the firefighters, shaking his head, said, "Looks like someone lit off something a lot hotter than a hickory log in there." It was a sobering sight. The minor injuries were a gut punch. I hadn't wanted anyone hurt, just for Brenda to face consequences. But the damage was done. The fire department taped off the living room, telling them they couldn't stay until a structural engineer cleared the place. Hairline cracks were already visible across the ceiling. A couple of days later, the fire marshal and an insurance investigator showed up at my door. They asked if I had seen or heard anything. I told them I'd felt the blast, saw the smoke, and that was it. Then the investigator asked the critical question, "Do you have any fireworks or pyrotechnic materials stored on your property?" I could have lied, but I didn't. I admitted I had some old leftovers from a trip years ago, bought out of state, and I'd been meaning to dispose of them properly. I took them to my garage, showed them the tub with the small stuff, and pointed out the empty crate with the giant, screaming black warnings on 3 sides. I explained, completely truthfully, that I'd been experimenting with novelty logs for a big outdoor fire ring I was planning when the snow was deep, and that they were never, ever meant to be used indoors, which is why I'd plastered the crate with warnings. I said they had gone missing, and I assumed some neighborhood kids had messed with them. I didn't mention my expectation of Brenda's sticky fingers. The result was swift and devastating for Brenda. The investigators found conclusive evidence, residue, scorch marks, cardboard fragments, that something explosive had gone off inside the firebox. When they asked Brenda where she got her wood, she gave conflicting stories, a local vendor, a neighbor, but she never admitted to stealing it through the fence. The insurance company, based on the findings, denied a massive portion of the claim. They'll cover random house fires, but they balk when you introduce explosives. They reasoned it was misuse of unknown explosive materials and failure to properly supervise the contents of the fire. This left the Sterlings on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars. New stone facade, new mantle, new drywall, ceiling repair, replacing the high-end TV and furniture, and all the fancy finishes. They had to take out a home equity loan. Over the next few months, their house was a construction site, looking like a bombed-out war zone from the street. I went to exactly one more HOA meeting. Brenda showed up late, looking utterly defeated, trying to run the meeting like nothing happened. But the energy was gone. People were polite, but the queen bee had been dethroned. A couple of neighbors, emboldened, even brought up the woodpile rules, asking why fines had been issued in the first place. The treasurer, who had previously supported Brenda, suddenly spoke up, agreeing that the board had been overzealous. Not long after, an email went out. Brenda was stepping down as HOA president to focus on personal matters. Nobody said it was because she'd blown up her own living room, but everyone thought it. The new board, focused more on plowing roads than aesthetic policing, quickly clarified the rules. Firewood storage was explicitly allowed. The violation on my wood pile quietly disappeared. No apology, of course, but no more fines. Brenda and her family? The financial ruin and the social fallout broke them. They dialed everything back. No more parties, no more community posts. They didn't sell, but they basically vanished into their construction project, finally focusing on their own affairs rather than everyone else's. Do I feel guilty? Yeah, sometimes. Seeing people stumble out covered in dust and glass was deeply unsettling. It wasn't satisfying, it was sobering. It reminded me that even when someone absolutely deserves consequences, collateral damage is real. I don't recommend my method. I won't call it a noble act. But in my own personal accounting, the score feels balanced. She tried to burn my money and make my life miserable, and in the end, she ended up burning her own house and her reputation instead. So what do you think? Was I the a-hole for planting the bait, even with the screaming warnings? Did I go too far, or was this the only language an HOA bully like Brenda Sterling would ever truly understand? Let me know why. In the comments below. Drop a like, subscribe for more stories, and tell me, what is the craziest thing you've ever done to fight back against a tyrannical HOA?